Hey everybody, so if you didn't get the disclaimer at the beginning of the part 1 video, here's another one. This video contains descriptions of very brutal, very violent, very bloody murders that most likely did actually happen. Listener discretion is advised. Okay, here we go. At the end of the pillaging season, all the raiding parties of Native Americans assembled. Besides Peter, they had 3 prisoners with them. The first 2 they tied to a tree and burned alive. The third they buried in the ground up to his neck. They then ripped the scalp off his head. After a few hours of suffering, the Indians lit a fire next to his head. The man screamed for a mercy killing as his eyes melted out of the sockets and his brains boiled. This is real life. Peter was made to dig graves for them. Williamson, for whatever reason, was kept alive. The Indians took him back to their more permanent settlement, where their women and children were, to be kept as a slave during the winter. Peter describes it as being 200 miles from any civilization. While there, he describes at length a cultural custom in which those of the community who are too old to hunt for food are forcibly killed by the young of the tribe. This is done by swinging tomahawks at their heads, sometimes taking up to an hour for the skull to crack open. While at the settlement, he calls the name Alamingo, he was left outside the whole time, with few clothes except for some scraps of material that the natives used to clothe themselves. He built a small structure for himself, resembling one of the Indian wigwams that he saw, and he had to keep a fire burning in it almost constantly for fear of freezing to death. This went on for months, until very early spring, 1755, a war party of 150 Indians was gathered to once again raid in rural Pennsylvania, and they took Peter with them. Well, after starting up travel again, of course one of Peter's main thoughts is escape. He waits for a good moment, because he knows if he gets captured after trying to escape, he'll be killed in the most brutal way imaginable. Finally, there's a time during the night when all of the captors are fast asleep. Peter notices this and just sort of walks off. A little distance away, he can hear one of them yelling. They woke up. They know he's gone. He has to run. He runs a long distance until he finds a hollow tree that he can hide in. He's tired. He climbs inside. Moments later, he hears footsteps and voices. The Indians are outside looking for him. Eventually, it gets quiet. Peter stays in there. He stays in there all day before coming out, because he wants to make sure the Indians are far away. This was one of the riskiest moments of his life. When he comes out, his next goal is to find a road, or any kind of civilization again. He's alone in the woods. He wanders. He's lost for days. Eventually, he climbs a tall hill, and from the top, he can see a house. He knows that house. He knows where he is. Overjoyed, he rushes towards it and knocks on the door. He hears screaming inside. A moment later, the door opens, and his old friend, John Bell, is pointing a gun at him. It was then that he realized he looked very much like a Native American. He then did his best to explain very quickly that, no, he was not an Indian, yes, he was Peter, and no, he did not die months ago when his house was attacked. With that confusing and potentially dangerous situation cleared up, they invite Peter inside. He stays for a few days, gets a good night's sleep, gets cleaned up, starts eating full meals, and is gifted with sufficient clothing for the first time in a very long while. Being fully recovered, and now knowing where he is and what day it is, he sets out to travel east. On January 4th, he will arrive at his father-in-law's house and found out that his wife is dead, not from Indians, but from illness. With no family, no home, and no money, he is now little better than he was when he left Hugh Wilson's service. What he did have now, though, was quite a story to tell. Everybody, wherever he went, after they heard that Peter Williamson was back from the dead, they wanted him to tell him all about it. Even the government of Pennsylvania, the Assembly and the governor, summoned Peter to tell them what he knew about the military situation of any French or French-aligned Indians that he saw. After being back for some time, he now faced the decision of what to do next. Well, he still technically owned the land that him and his wife were living on before, but all the buildings were burned down, and if he went back to rebuild, what's stopping the same group of Indians from coming to find him again? No, he didn't want that to happen. He couldn't just live off the hospitality of his father-in-law either. He needed to go get a job somewhere. Where he would go to look for one is the city of Philadelphia, and where he would find one was the Royal Army. Peter Williamson would join the army and fight in the French and Indian War. In March, he arrived in Boston, where his regiment under command of General Shirley was training. Peter makes a habit of writing his impressions of every large city he visits. He says of this one, a gentleman of London would fancy himself at home in Boston. During his time in training, there was an incident where the house of a prominent citizen was attacked by Indians. The man, his wife, and 9 of their servants were scalped and killed, and the children were not found, assumed to be taken prisoner. Now, if there's one thing Americans have always done well, it's vigilante posses. In response to public outcry, a group of 100 volunteers, including Peter and some of the soldiers he was training with, set out to hunt down the Indians that did this. It took them a few days of tracking the party through the woods, but they eventually found the party of 50 Native Americans responsible for the crime. There was a fight, and the 100-man mob won. After the fight, they found the dead man's daughter, starved half to death, clothes ripped to shreds, and tied to a tree. The men untied her and carried her on a stretcher and helped her recover. When she could talk, she told them how the Indians scalped her brother and made fun of him while he was suffering. They then cut his stomach open and removed some of his guts, but he was still alive. They put pine wood in it and lit it on fire and kept making fun of him. Finally, they burned him alive while she watched. After rescuing the girl, the men in the lynch mob argued over who gets to cut the scalps off the dead Indian bodies. On July 1st, 1755, the regiment, fully trained, started marching. The plan was to stop at Albany and then keep going to Oswego, which at the time was an English fort on the southern coast of Lake Ontario. Peter mentions that there's also an Indian trading post at the fort and takes the opportunity to write a little more about Indian culture. He writes that Native American babies, when they're born, look a lot like white babies. Most natives put effort into tanning and rubbing grease on their skin in order to darken their skin tone. He also writes that French religious missionaries spread lies among the Indian community saying that the English killed Jesus Christ and that the second coming of Jesus would happen after all English people were killed. Go figure. The people defending Oswego Fort, well, they had a bit of a tough time. Constant paranoia, worrying that the French could attack at any time and knowing that if they did, they could probably take the fort easily because they had more troops and better boats on the lake. The pay was bad, the food was bad, and sometimes not enough. Disease was going around, many of the soldiers just deserted and ran away. In the cold fall months of 1755, Peter managed to fall into a river. His friends helped him out and dried him off, and soon after had him sitting with them around a fire, when suddenly he just went pale and fainted. They marked him as injured and sent him to a hospital in New York. There he made a full recovery. He writes that New York is ritzy, aristocratic, and that the people there are good at drinking. After his recovery, Peter asks his general for time off to visit Pennsylvania. He was granted 3 months. Williamson visits Philadelphia again, during the better part of a year while he was away. People seem to have gotten a lot more on edge. The Indian attacks hadn't stopped. In fact, they had been getting more frequent and coming further east, even striking some places that people might refer to as West Philly. It seemed like everyone had a sort of anger and fear to match the ferocity of the attacks. He reports that Berks County was now more or less a wasteland of burned or abandoned houses, and that hundreds, if not thousands of people now found themselves on the streets of Philly without a place to stay. He tells more stories of Indian attacks. He talks about homes with newborn babies who were scalped along with their parents, one in particular where the mother's dead body was found with the dead baby being used as a pillow, and even tells one story about a woman who intentionally fell down on top of her baby so that when the Indians scalped her they didn't notice the baby underneath and left it to grow up as an orphan. Williamson observes that Pennsylvania probably could have defeated their Native American enemies if it weren't for the pacifist nature of the large Quaker population influencing the local government, making them averse to the idea of any armed militia. The thing that changed their minds, he records, was a visit. Messengers from a friendly Indian tribe to the city of Philadelphia. The messengers announced that without the help of the English or some other ally, they would lose the war. The French-aligned tribes recently sent a message saying that if they did not betray the English, they would come and burn the village and destroy their tribe's language and culture. If they tried, the friendly tribe did not have enough warriors to stop it. Because of the urgent nature of this request, this would be the last plea from the friendly Indians for a friendly militia from Philadelphia. The letter was read aloud in the public square. Peter witnessed the authorities in Philadelphia have a heated discussion, resulting in the allowance of a civilian-run militia with officers elected by the soldiers who would communicate with the Pennsylvania government. Having nothing better to do with the rest of his 3 months, Peter joined, and since he had experience fighting as a trained regular in the British Army, he was assigned a position training 100 new recruits and given the rank of acting lieutenant. In December 1755, they would march west to reclaim Pennsylvania's frontier from the Indians.
Hark now the drums beat up again, for old true soldier gentlemen, then let us list and march, I say.